Introduction to Class Preparation Assignment number 2. We're going to study a lot of things today, including the differences between stocks and bonds, what are asset classes, and what are mutual funds. Investment policy statements, the concept of asset allocation, a very important concept. Risk and return are related. Standard deviation as one measure of risk, and then individual and investor perceptions of risk are often different from the academic view of risk. All right. Portfolio rebalancing, a very important process that has occurred in the management of portfolios. The all-important concept, my favorite one word in investing, diversification. Correlation, which is related to standard deviation in terms of how we mix asset classes and investments. The concept called the efficient frontier, which grows out of modern portfolio theory, which we'll just basically touch on. I have a couple of videos, one at the beginning and one at the end. The first one is the power of sleep. So I encourage you to go to Blackboard and you'll see the video for the power of sleep there. It's a short video, very important video to watch. Now, welcome back. Welcome back. So, question for you. Why is the bear both black as a black bear and also blue as in a blue bear? And the answer is yes. Your professor was working his way through college while a character at Disney World, and yes, I was Baloo. Baloo the bear, as well as Brer Bear and Little John, and in a show where you did some costume changes, I was actually Winnie the Pooh as well. So I was Minnie Bears and also some other characters at Disney World for several years. What a great way to go to college. All right. You watched The Power of Sleep. I just want to remind you that you need this book, Class Preparation Assignment. For this class preparation assignment, it's the All About Asset Allocation book, the second edition by Rick Ferry. You should be able to find used copies of it available out there. We've been using this book in this class for several years. However, if not, you can download this on Kindle. And the Kindle app you can download for free to your computer, to your laptop, to your device, your tablet, or even your phone, and read there as well. So everyone should be able to access that book in time for completing the assignment, which is due by Sunday night. Also, a reminder, you might want to work ahead, especially the first week or so. If you don't have a lot of assignments yet, read this book, The Richest Man in Babylon. It is available as PDF files. There's 3 different versions of the file. The content is the same, it's just the layout of the text is different, so you can choose which type of layout that you like to read. It's going to take you somewhere between 2 to 3 hours to read. I would encourage you to break that up into 2 sessions. Read it slowly. All right, and also look at the instructions, and then perhaps even start work ahead, work on the essay for that. Get that done, because although this is due the Sunday after Thanksgiving, it's a lot easier to get work done ahead of time now. It's going to be much more stressful as you get to the end of the semester. All right, so a lot of concepts today. Let's discuss stocks and bonds. All right, stocks, also called equities. So whenever I talk about stocks or stock mutual funds, I also might use the word equities for that. All right, that's ownership of a corporation versus bonds. Now this is actually a picture of the New York Stock Exchange from several years ago. They actually don't have people on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange anymore. At least here during this pandemic, all of the trading is done basically electronically at this point. And even nowadays, even before the pandemic, the number of people on the floor of the stock exchange was dramatically reduced. Here's a picture of a stock. This is common stock in General Motors Corporation. 5 shares of stock that was held by somebody. The stock was issued back in 1955. If you used to own shares of stock, you would actually get the certificates, and you would put that certificate into typically your safe deposit box or something. But then computers came along, and basically brokerage firms now hold the stock for you, and it shows up on the statement that you get from the brokerage firm, or of course you can go online and view your account at any time. But there is one stock. Can you guess what it is? One stock where people still want to get the certificate, and the answer is yes, it's the Walt Disney Company. Why? Because young parents, when they have their babies, would typically go out and buy 50 or 100 shares of stock, and then they'll take this certificate and frame it and put it up on their nursery wall because they like it so much. All right, and it's an investment for the future of their children, I guess, as well. All right. So stocks also, when we talk about stocks, when typically we're talking about common stock, there's another class of stock called preferred stock, which really operates a lot more like a bond than common stock. So when we talk about stocks or equities, we're talking about common stock of corporation. That's the class of stock that we're dealing with, and that's the most common stock out there. Uh, they represent fractional ownership of corporation. You're not required to turn it in at any one date unless there's a takeover or something of the corporation, which is relatively rare. So basically, you own stocks perpetually. If you own a share of stock in Apple Corporation, you own less than 1 billionth of a share of stock in Apple Corporation. So it's a fractional share. Investors receive a rate of return on that stock. They might get dividends. Not all corporations issue dividends, and sometimes they issue dividends and the amount of dividends go up or it goes down or they stop paying dividends. Um, for example, here in the pandemic that we're in currently, a lot of corporations are conserving cash by not paying dividends because they very uncertain economic future for them. Uh, and you also can get a rate of return on your investment if the stock price of the stock goes up. So the value of the stock goes up, which of course you can lose value if the stock goes down. Now stocks are risky. Why? Because if the corporation files bankruptcy, and by the way, there are lots of corporations that file bankruptcy every year, all right, then all of the assets of that corporation are liquidated in what's called a liquidation bankruptcy, and the creditors, which includes holders of bonds, bondholders are creditors of a corporation, they all get paid first. How much do the shareholders get? Typically, almost always, zero. Yeah. So shareholders typically get zero in bankruptcy. It's theoretically possible that they get something, but typically the debts of the corporation exceed the value of the assets during a liquidation process. Right? So here's a bond. Bonds issued by corporations and governments are typically issued in $1,000 increments. All right, now this is a 1996 bond in terms of its maturity date, issued by Pennzoil United. It had an interest rate of 5.25%, which means that it paid interest of $50.25 every 6 months. It actually paid $25, 12.5 cents every 6 months. Combined for the year, it was $50.25. So, and on top of that, you would get the interest at maturity. The interest at maturity was sometime in 1996. All right. So you would get your principal back at maturity, is what I meant. All right. So you get that $1,000 back along with the last interest payment. Here's another type of bond you may be familiar with. It's a Series EE bond. You can used to be able to buy these in $25 increments, $100 increments. You used to go down to the bank and actually buy these. A lot of people used to invest in these, especially when interest rates were a lot higher. Nowadays, if you want to buy these bonds, you actually set up an account online. We'll look at that later. But you will still see a lot of these bonds out there. Your grandparents, your parents may actually own these bonds. And typically they'll have them stay stashed in a safe place or something like that, and they're waiting for the bonds to mature. Here's an old bond, 1907, issued by the city of Los Angeles for waterworks, constructing some of their ways of getting more water into the city. All right. So what is a bond? Basically, you are loaning money to either the corporation or the government. If it is a U.S. bond, it's called a Treasury security, U.S. Treasury security, all right. Or perhaps it's you're loaning money to, for example, Western Kentucky University, which issues some bonds, or the state of Kentucky, or the state of Tennessee, or the Orlando Airport Authority, or the New York Port Authority, which is buses and other things in the subways and like in the state of New York. So lots of different municipalities, they're called, cities and towns and states and other entities created by states issue what are called municipal bonds. All right. Foreign governments and all of their subdivisions can also issue bonds as well. So what do you get? Well, you get interest and you get the principal amount at maturity. Now, the value of a bond can go up and down. Let's say, for example, that a bond was issued by, let's say, American Airlines. Okay? American Airlines, all the airline companies are not doing quite well right now. So bondholders might say, I'm not sure I'm going to get all of my money back. Maybe American Airlines would file bankruptcy at some point. So the value of the bond could go down. If interest rates go up, as we'll study, the value of bonds also can go down. So you don't always, there's risk there. It's not as risky in terms of the up and down movement of the value as you typically see in a stock, but there's a risk there that you don't get all of your money back at maturity. Bondholders are creditors of the company, so if there is a bankruptcy, wages get paid first in a liquidation bankruptcy, and then the bondholders, along with other creditors, like people who may have sold goods to the corporation, they all get paid as the corporation's assets are liquidated. And typically, they get paid somewhere between 30% and 60% of the value of what was loaned, the principal amount that was valued, that was loaned to the corporation. Now, that 30 to 60% is called the average recovery rate. What is the recovery rate of a bondholder? And sometimes it can be less than 30%, sometimes it can be more than 60%, but on average, somewhere between 30 to 60%. Contrast that with shareholders who basically get zero almost all the time. So, yeah, there's a difference here in terms of risk. So, what are the fundamental differences between common stocks and bonds? Well, stocks are more risky. In liquidation bankruptcy, shareholders typically get nothing. Bondholders typically get something, some percentage of their original investments. All right? Bonds don't go up and down in value as much as stocks typically go up and down. All right? Stocks, you get dividends and you get gains from the increase in the value of the stock. Bondholders typically get interest payments. Of course, the value of a bond could go up as well. If interest rates go down, value of bonds go down. Or if you bought a bond at a discount and the corporation got better financially, the value of the bond in the marketplace might go up. All right. So basically, stocks on an individual basis, certainly, and even on a diversified basis, are riskier than bonds. And one of the concepts we'll see is that risk and return are related. If you have more investment risk, and there are all different types of investment risk out there, then you're going to have a greater expected return in terms of what the investor expects. Risk and return are related. Let's take a pause at this point, and then I'll head on to the next section. We are back from our pause. Yes, and we're going to study asset classes and mutual funds. So, what is an asset class? Basically, it's a group of securities that possesses similar characteristics, such as stocks, also called equities, fixed income, real estate, cash. Those are typically called the four major investment asset classes. And then there are some alternative investments. Sometimes real estate is grouped as an alternative investment. I think it's really one of the four major asset classes. But commodities, hedge funds, and there's some other types of alternative investments out there. All right, so a broad asset class is equities. Now we can break up the broad asset class into different sub-asset classes like U.S. stocks and foreign developed markets, emerging market stocks, or technology stocks versus consumer product stocks, things of that nature. But typically, just you can actually buy a mutual fund that owns the entire U.S. stock market, and it's called a total stock market index fund, or pretty much the total stock market in developed markets or emerging markets or all international stocks, basically all international publicly traded stocks, or a really good selection of them. All right. Again, we call stocks, including stock mutual funds, equities. You'll see that term used a lot in this course. Fixed income investments include bonds. They can also include some other types of fixed income investments like market CDs that are basically traded in the marketplace, although they're certificates of deposit issued by banks, not necessarily bonds. Um, there are different types of bonds again. You have investment grade corporates, you have high yield bonds, which are issued by corporations. They are non investment grade. You have municipal bonds, you have government bonds, you have government bonds that are linked to the rate of inflation. You have bonds that are formed basically where you loan money and there's a pool out there that goes out and buys mortgages, and that pool basically pays as the mortgage payments are made. You get a rate of return on that. And then there's something called structured finances, other types of fixed income that we typically won't study in this course. One of the reasons is you shouldn't invest in them. All right, it's just a little bit beyond this course. All right. So let's explore what is a mutual fund. All right. And to do that, let's turn our attention to Vanguard.com. Now, Vanguard is a mutual fund company. There are lots of different mutual fund companies out there, but Vanguard's a little bit different from the rest. All right. The reason is almost all mutual fund companies are owned by investors. So typically you might have a family that started a mutual fund company and still owns it, or you have shareholders of a mutual fund that own the shares of the mutual fund. But Vanguard is a little bit different. Vanguard was started by Jack Bogle, and when he started in 1975 or so, basically he said the shareholders of the funds are going to own the mutual fund complex. So basically, it operates kind of like a non-profit corporation because there's no requirement to issue profits to the shareholders of the company. Basically, that allows them to keep their fees really low. Now, if you go to the Vanguard main website, then you want to go to personal investors down here. So we'll click that on and wait for that to load. Internet's just a little on the slow side, more than a little on the slow side. I wonder why that is. All right. And here we see a whole bunch of things. If you have an account at Vanguard, it's very easy to set up an account there. You could actually see what's in your account, a lot of different investment account types, and doing rollovers for 401k. You can see here Vanguard mutual funds, exchange traded funds, which we'll look at later. They sell other mutual funds from different companies. They can sell stocks here, and you can actually buy CDs and bonds at Vanguard as well. Then there's a whole bunch of advice here about investing for college, how much you should have an emergency fund, how to save for retirement, even information about Social Security and things like that, and newsletters and the like, and an exploration of cost and why they are different. So we'll take a look at Vanguard mutual funds. Click on that, and then we'll go down here and say browse Vanguard funds by asset class, and we'll allow that to pull up. Vanguard has, again, really low cost mutual funds relative to a lot of others. Not necessarily the lowest cost, there are some exceptions out there, but on average, all of Vanguard mutual funds are pretty low in cost relative to most everybody else. They have 132 different mutual funds, and what we can see here is money market funds, and then we have bond funds, U.S. bond funds that invest in U.S. Treasury securities of some type. And then we have investment grade corporate bond funds, and we have short term and long term bond funds, for example. And then we have what's called the high yield or below investment grade. Then we have tax exempt, these are the municipal bond funds. We have balanced funds, these are typically used in 401k plans. Basically, it said, hey, if you wanted to go work for a corporation and your retirement date was going to be 2065, all right, you can invest in one mutual fund that has a combination of stock and bond funds in it, and that allocation, how much is allocated to stocks or bonds, automatically changes as you get closer to your retirement date to basically become more conservative. Then we have other mutual funds out there. We have a whole bunch of U.S. stock funds here. Here's the largest mutual fund in the world. It's called the 500 Index Mutual Fund. It has the most money in it of all funds out there. All right, and then a whole bunch of different ones. Here's a large cap index. Here's a growth index fund. U.S. of value. We'll be studying growth and value. Here are what's called mid cap funds and small cap. We'll be studying small cap and mid cap to a degree. There are international bond funds and international stock funds. There are developed market stocks funds. And then if we go down further, we see emerging market stocks funds. And there's all different types of funds that have different investment strategies. For example, here's an international value fund, for example. Then there's even specific sector funds, like if you just want to invest in stocks that have energy holdings or healthcare or real estate. There's something here that owns a lot of REITs, and we'll study REITs as an example. So just to come up here, this is just a way of getting and looking at different funds by different asset classes. Give you an overview of what a mutual fund is. A mutual fund is basically where you take your cash, you combine it with that cash of other investors, and the investment manager then goes out and buys a whole bunch of different stocks or bonds or some combination of that, or even what's called real estate investment trust. All right. So do all mutual funds invest in asset classes? Typically so. Some invest very broadly asset classes. Other might be very narrow, like technology stocks, or even just internet stocks or biotechnology stocks. Some mutual funds combine asset classes, so you might have some stocks and bonds in it, for example, as we saw when we were looking at Vanguard. So another pause. Let's study asset allocation and the investment policy statement. Just give you a brief overview of that. Now, investment policy statements are written documents that are almost always done for endowment funds like the Western Kentucky University Foundation or other foundations. Typically, we'll have an investment policy for it. Also, pension plans. They have increasingly been done by individual investors. And what I'd like you to do is watch this video on Vimeo at this point, and I will try to pull that up for us. See if I can pull that up for us and get it going here without a substantial lag. All right, so here we go. Do, 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 do.
Every investment involves both risk and reward. Despite fancy calculations and theories, there are few guarantees. Fortune 500 companies, large institutions, and the ultra-wealthy face the same risks as you when they invest. How do they manage their portfolios? They have a blueprint, a set of guidelines for making investment decisions, with checks and balances to monitor their progress. This blueprint is called an investment policy statement. There was a time when these policy statements were created only for the ultra-wealthy investors, but guess what? If it works for them, it can work for you. Work with us to create your own investment policy statement. If you use multiple advisors, designate a primary advisor who can see all your relationships and all your holdings. Use the new technology that can help you avoid conflicting investments in your portfolios that could create asset allocation or tax inefficiencies. The big picture is a key to the successful management of your overall plan. When you collaborate with us to manage your investment policy statement, you're on your way to accomplishing your life's financial goals. And that's exactly where you want to be.
Not a bad video from LeConte Wealth Manager, an investment advisory firm somewhere here in the United States. Yeah, so we'll close out of this and get back here. All right, what does an investment policy statement look like? Well, there's a lot of sections to it. What are the objectives of the investor? What is their time horizon? When are they going to start pulling money out of the portfolio? What is the investor's risk tolerance? We'll be discussing risk tolerance later. Basically, how much risk can the investor take on? Liquidity. Do we need the money to be immediately accessible, or can some of it be tied up for a long period of time? Most of the time, we want to keep our portfolios liquid. How much income is needed from the portfolio? What asset classes can we invest in? Maybe, for example, somebody might say, I don't want to invest in tobacco stocks, for example. That might be a constraint or restriction on that. Investment guidelines, basically the asset allocation. How much are we going to put in stocks versus bonds versus real estate versus cash? On the stock side, how much are we going to put in U.S. stocks versus foreign stocks, just as an example? Are we going to measure how we're doing? If we're measuring that, what benchmarks are we going to measure against? Who's going to monitor the portfolio, and what type of reports might be generated for the investor? All right. So take a look at all that. Here's an example of an investment policy statement. Not a very good one in my view, but it's relatively short, which is one of the reasons I'm using it. All right. It's set forth in writing. It sets forth objectives and the asset allocation and the like. All right. It has a profile of the investor, someone who's making a decent amount of money here, but not a lot of assets, especially since they want to begin withdrawing this from 6 to 10 years. They're not going to have a lot here. They expect a fairly low rate, average annual rate of return. All right, and they say you could tolerate a temporary decline in your portfolio of -5%. That's a very, very low risk tolerance. I think that's like totally inappropriate in terms of somebody's risk tolerance and what somebody should be looking at from certainly a longer term investor. All right, and basically, what is their objective? Here is to achieve moderate growth in income. I don't know what that term means. A lot of times, more the objective is like going to use these monies for retirement. In this case, they want to start taking the money out in 6 to 10 years. And what is their risk tolerance? Here they say uh, very low, medium to high volatility, which a temporary decline in the portfolio over a 1 year period of -5%. If you have a highly volatility portfolio, you could have a 1 year period decline of 50% or something like that in a portfolio. So that's kind of weird that they actually state that. Here, the portfolio sets forth an asset allocation, so it has how much is going to be put in each asset classes. Now, they do this here, which is another reason I don't like this, by actually saying, here are the mutual funds where you're going to invest in. It happens to be their own mutual funds from this investment advisor, at least most of them. All right, and then monitoring procedures. Who's going to monitor it? It turns out the investment managers will monitor, and they'll automatically rebalance the portfolio when things deviate from their target asset allocation by 2.5%, and they'll do that quarterly. All right, so then the advisor signs it, and then the client signs it and acknowledges certain things. There's no guarantee, for example. All right, so what is an investment policy statement? It's basically a contract, an agreement between the investor and the portfolio manager. And some of its sections, probably the most important part is what is your asset allocation? But also, when are you going to use this money? What goals is this for? What permitted investments are allowed? Or are there some investment types that are excluded? Right? Do individual investors have to have this IPS or investment policy statement? And the answer is no. It's not required by any law or regulation. But it's actually a really good thing, and more individual investors are getting these. So, just kind of a definition, if you want one, a document drafted between a portfolio manager and a client that outlines the general rules that the portfolio manager is going to follow. This document provides also the goals of the portfolio, the objectives of the clients, and it describes the strategies that the manager should employ. Now, these documents can be a page long, they can be 40 pages long. All right, so there's a wide variance on how these things are drafted. There's no law that requires this to be done for individual investors, but it's a great thing to have. So again, goals, investment time horizon, risk tolerance or risk profile, expected rate of return might be stated in there, may not be. Certainly an asset allocation is included in that. And who is deciding exactly what to invest in? And is there process defined in that? Sometimes you'll see great details in investment policy statements about that. Sometimes you won't even see that addressed at all. Again, a little pause. We're back and we got a lot of concepts to go over. Risk versus return and related standard deviation as one measure of risk. Some other different types of risk, at least from the investor standpoint, how investors perceive risk. Correlation, very important concept. Diversification, my favorite word in all of investing. And then we get into the efficient frontier and modern portfolio theory. All right. So, if we all so basically, risk and return are related. All right. If you look over a period of time, for example, let's say a 1 year period of time, all right, and you have a portfolio that's on the left that is 20% allocated to stocks and 80% allocated to, we'll say, safe fixed income investments, safe short term bonds, for example, the range of returns in any 1 year might be as much as plus 20% or maybe minus about 10%. So hey, that's a potential range of returns. But if you get to the far right and you have a 100% portfolio, the range of returns perhaps as good as maybe 50, 55%, as bad as 40, 50% in terms of value for a 100% equity portfolio. And what we'll see here is that potential range of returns, this is a 1 year period of time. If you look over like a 2 or 3 year period of time, the potential range of returns for investing in stocks can actually be downside risk where you have a loss of value of like 90% of the value of your stock portfolio. So if you're at a 100% stock portfolio, you can see something worse. Now we're going to explore this range of returns and how it varies over time as well. All right, so basically, if you have a higher allocation to equities, you would expect over a longer period of time that you're going to have a higher rate of return. And this kind of illustrates that. All right, so here's different portfolios formed by BNL, which apparently is some type of uh, investment advisor down in New Zealand, by the way, and it has different portfolios. And over this period of time, a 20% equities, 80% fixed income investment, 80% bonds, for example, compared to a 90% equities and 10%. What you see is that the rate of return of this more conservative portfolio was 8%. The more risky portfolio was 9.5%. Now, this was a period of time when basically bond prices were going down quite a bit. So, actually, bonds did really well over this period of time. Um, so, you wouldn't see this repeated as much. You'd see a much more bigger difference in terms of rate of returns over, for example, the next 15 years in all likelihood. We also see standard deviation. All right? That's the volatility of the portfolio. So we have return on the y-axis, we have standard deviation on the x-axis, and standard deviation is basically a measure of how much does the portfolio go up and down in value over time. Right? And basically you measure what's called the variance of the portfolio. You take the square root of that, and that gives you standard deviation. And standard deviation is one measure of risk. It's kind of the academic view of risk. All right. So, if we look at individual investors, though, we start explaining standard deviation to them, they don't really get it. All right. However, what they do think about risk is, am I going to lose this money forever? That's a permanent loss of their capital. All right. And more importantly, and the way a lot of people view risk is, am I going to not be able to meet my financial goals as a result of the risk that I'm taking? And sometimes to meet your financial goals, you have to take on risk. You have to outperform inflation, for example, and let the portfolio grow over time. So not taking on any risk could lead somebody to not meet their financial goals. But there's also risk that the market might decline by 90% in value, and what's that going to do to an investor? You have to explore that as well. Here's a question for you. How much could you lose if you invest all of your money in Apple Inc. common stock? Now, this stock back in July of 2018 was worth, the whole company, all the stock of that company was worth $939 billion. 6 months later, it had fallen to about $746 billion. And as of July 20th of 2020, it's the biggest corporation in the world, barely. All right, there's several corporations right behind it, but it's worth all the value of its stock is worth 1.69 trillion dollars. Wow! So how much money could you lose if you just put all your money in Apple Inc. stock? The answer is you could lose all of it. All right? There are examples out there of exactly that happening. For example, Enron was the eighth largest U.S. corporation. It had a massive accounting scandal back in 2002, 2003, somewhere in there. And basically, Enron went bankrupt from the eighth largest corporation to basically worth zero, the stock, just in the course of 6 months. That typically doesn't happen for very large corporations, but you can see a big decline in the value of the stock. For example, at one point, General Electric stock was worth over $60 a share. Right? Then, 7 years later, it was worth $6 a share at one point. So you had a 90% fall in value of one of the most respected corporations out there, a very highly diversified industrial company. All right, now the stock has recovered somewhat, but not up to where it was really 20 years ago in terms of its value. So, wow, you can lose money by investing in individual stocks. There's no question about it. You'd be surprised how many large corporations no longer are in existence 20 years later. Yeah, a lot of them. So, how do you guard against losing all your wealth? What is my favorite word in all of investing? Diversification! Repeat after me. Diversify, diversify, diversify. Always diversify. Yes. Never turn down. We'll call this a free lunch in investing. Diversification. It helps to reduce the risk of losing all of your money. And there's a lot of different investment risk out there, but this one you can actually reduce what's called idiosyncratic risk or diversifiable risk quite a lot through diversification. Now, I want to give you an example of portfolio rebalancing. Let's say you put 50% of your investment portfolio in a Vanguard mutual fund called the Vanguard Total U.S. Stock Market Index Fund. So you own all of the stocks in the market. Now, that's about 3,600 stocks out there that are held by this mutual fund. Not all of them are equally weighted. So, for example, you're going to own a lot more of Apple and Microsoft, for example, than you are of the smallest stock that's out there. About 50% of your investment portfolio is invested in what's called the Vanguard Total U.S. Bond, corporate bond index funds. It doesn't own all the bonds out there, but it owns about 900 different types of bonds out there. And then if the stock fund goes up 20% in value and the bond fund falls 5% in value, what you end up with is not $1,000 in each, but you're going to end up with 1,200 in stocks, 950 in bonds, and your asset allocation is not 50-50 anymore. It's 56-44. So what do? To rebalance the portfolio, we take some money off the table, we sell some of the stocks fund, and we buy some more of the bond fund. And we end up with, after rebalancing, 1,175 in stocks and 1,175 in bonds. Not bad, okay? So that's rebalancing. A concept related to standard deviation and the way that we build portfolios is correlation. Correlation is measured by something called the correlation coefficient, which varies from +1 to -1. And in investing, we'd love to have investments that go up in value, but if we had two investments that were perfectly negatively correlated, they had a correlation coefficient of -1. For example, investment C and D here, as investment D goes up, investment C goes down, and vice versa. Combined, if you own 50% of each, you would be along this red line, which is a really smooth ride for you, right? But the problem is that there are very few investments, none out there, that are perfectly negatively correlated. But so we search for negatively correlated asset classes, but we don't see a lot of them. For example, here are U.S. large cap stocks. Correlation to U.S. large cap stocks, the same asset class is a 1, +1. Right? Correlation to U.S. small company stocks, which we'll explore what that means, 0.93. That's a very high positive correlation. Foreign developed market stocks, 0.58. That's a strong positive correlation. Emerging markets equity, 0.51. Not quite as strong, but strong. But look at U.S. bonds. U.S. long-term bonds have a negative correlation to large cap stocks, which is nice to see. If compared to the small cap stocks, they have a negative correlation. To emerging market stocks, they have a slightly negative correlation there as well. Something called Treasury inflation protected securities have are non-correlated to large cap stocks. And then we have these alternative asset classes. We looked at real estate, positive correlation, commodities, positive correlation, hedge funds. We'll explore all of these. We won't be looking at currencies investing in this class because that's not something you should actually be doing. But you see that almost all of the asset classes are positively correlated here. All right? Also, correlations of asset classes can vary over time. So if we were to compare U.S. large company stocks to foreign stocks, all right, well, the correlation used to be positive, fairly strong, but it's gotten even more positive as we've gone from one time period, 1995 to 2000, all the way to 2001, 2007. The next 6 years, what we see is a stronger correlation, even stronger correlation than the subsequent 6 years. Why is that? Why have international large company stocks become so correlated, more correlated to U.S. large company stocks? And the answer is large corporations have multinational operations, for one, and the other is there's a lot more trade, and that's one of the reasons emerging market stocks have also become a lot more positively correlated to large company U.S. stocks as well. Now, when we build portfolios, we can come up with what we call the efficient frontier. All right? And basically, let's say we take a portfolio that's 99% stocks and 1% fixed income. And he may be a portfolio that's 98% stocks and 1% fixed income. And another portfolio that's 20% fixed income and 80% stocks. By combining these asset classes in different percentages, what we can do is then map out what are the returns of that portfolio relative to the volatility of that portfolio. So we're mapping out basically returns versus standard deviation, and what we're going to end up with is a whole bunch of dots under this line here. Now that line basically is formed by the combination of all these portfolios. And that's where we want to be. We want to be along the efficient frontier because we're going to get the maximum amount of return for a certain level of volatility. At least that's the theory behind this. And we'd like to be in the upper left-hand side as much as possible. So we want to be that way towards the line. And that's called going towards the northwest corner. We want to be up there in the northwest corner. So let's just watch a brief video here that explores this whole concept of the efficient frontier. And this video, by the way, is from, one of my favorite websites, and perhaps one of yours as well.
Most investment choices.
Investopedia. Yes, it is. So we'll pull that up here. Bring this to...
Involve a trade-off between
Whoa! Stop, restart. Okay.
There's one last topic I wanted to talk about with regard to portfolio optimizers and modern portfolio theory. Consider these assets.
Most investment choices involve a trade-off between risk and reward. The Efficient Frontier is a modern portfolio theory tool that shows investors the best possible return they can expect from their portfolio given the level of volatility they're willing to accept. The chart here demonstrates this influential concept. The vertical axis represents an expected rate of return. The horizontal axis signifies the investor's risk tolerance. The frontier is the line curve, which shows the potential yield of portfolios given their degree of risk. Optimal portfolios should lie on this curve. Any portfolio that falls below the frontier curve represents a less than ideal mix of investments, because for the same risk, one could achieve a greater return. Any portfolio above this curve is impossible. Take Chris, who owns Portfolio A. Currently, his investments generate a combined yield of 8%. Based on the efficient frontier, however, Chris can be achieving the same level of return with a considerably safer mix of investments if he owned Portfolio B. Both portfolios offer the same level of return, but Portfolio B has a lesser risk. The job of investment advisors who use modern portfolio theory is to identify a basket of securities that gets as close as possible to the frontier. Investors should realize there's no preferred point on the frontier. A young professional is probably willing to accept a higher level of risk and will therefore want to be somewhere near the right of the curve. For an older adult nearing retirement, a portfolio further to the left may be ideal. What's important is to get as close as possible to the efficient frontier, whatever your risk profile may be.
Alright, I'm back. Alright, and we'll close out that video. Return to our slides. That's kind of an illustration of what the efficient frontier is all about. Now, modern portfolio theory, which is more than 65 years old at this point, is basically founded from a paper that was written a long time ago, posits that if you have two non-correlated assets, at least they're not perfectly correlated, all right, and you combine them in a portfolio, you can achieve either better returns or a reduction in risk, or possibly some combination of both, as long as you rebalance the portfolio periodically. That's kind of a concept that comes out of what we call modern portfolio theory. Now, we're going to study the efficient frontier and modern portfolio theory a little bit more. There's more in your readings and some videos to watch as well. So don't worry about understanding it fully at this point. You'll gain it over time here in the course. So can we explain these words in our own words? Standard deviation is basically the square root of variance. Variance is a measure of the volatility of this collection of assets, this portfolio. So standard deviation is one measure of risk, of investment risk. Correlation is whether assets are moving up and down with each other in terms of their value. All right, we have positive correlation. Perfect positive correlation is +1. Perfect negative correlation is -1. Most asset classes have a positive correlation to each other. Now, you might think, is there maybe a stock out there that has a negative correlation to another stock? And we might speculate, for example, that airline stocks might be negatively correlated as an asset class to stocks that basically are oil companies. All right? Why? Because if the price of oil goes up, the price of stocks that produce oil also goes up. At the same time, if the price of oil goes up, airline stocks typically fall because one of their biggest costs is jet fuel. So basically, we can see negatively correlated stocks there. That doesn't mean they always move up and down together, but it does. There are a negative correlation on different types of stocks here. Very important. Probably the most important decision any investor makes is what asset classes are they going to invest in and what percentage are they going to put in each one. And that's called asset allocation. Rebalancing is where we rebalance the portfolio. Typically, it can be done yearly, every 6 months, every 3 months, like quarterly. It can be done whenever things get out of whack by a certain degree. And there's actually software programs that investment advisors use nowadays that will alert you to say, hey, this client's portfolio is out of whack. And it'll actually suggest for you what you ought to do to get things back in track. And modern portfolio theory, as it relates to this search for the efficient frontier, basically says if we take two asset classes or two investments that are not perfectly correlated to each other and we combine them in a portfolio, we're going to have a less volatile portfolio and we can achieve either higher returns or a lower amount of risk as measured by standard deviation, or some combination of that, depending on how we combine them, as long as we rebalance the portfolio periodically. So, we're going to take a pause here, but what I want you to do is go on to another video, a very important video about self-control. It's set forth in Blackboard, and watch that video and answer some of the questions that is set forth on Blackboard as well. Just answer them for yourself. Thank you.